Okay. So thanks very much for coming. I'm thrilled. This is the first Zoom launch we've done for a while because we are back in real life, if you see what I mean. But this is an important book, and we decided, Susan and I, we wanted to have two launches. So I'm Camilla Reeve, and I run Pale Well Press, and we focus on books that help human rights, the environment, and what I call lost well-being, looking at situations of bereavement or trauma and what people do to deal with it. It's always been quite an important part of what we publish. And so when I saw Susan's book coming along, I was particularly interested because she puts her story, her novel, in a social context. This is not just somebody alone at home. This is how do you recover from trauma when you're still surrounded by a lot of the things that brought it on, and you have a social life that you have to maintain. In the case of one of the characters, he has a son he has to look after, among other things. So how do you start processing grief and loss in that situation? Anyway, this evening, Susan and I are going to be talking about the novel, and she'll be reading a number of extracts. As you heard, we're recording it. If you could now, I think you've all very kindly gone on to mute. It's brilliant. I don't have to ask you to do that. That's just fantastic. Now, we've got quite a lot of people here. At the end, we're going to have an opportunity for questions. And at that point, I'm going to ask people to use their thing called reactions, which is, in my case, at the bottom of the screen, in which you can raise a hand, and then I will see that you've raised a hand and ask you to say whatever it is you want to say. But for now, if you can let Susan and me talk, that would be brilliant. And for the few people, if there are any, who don't know Susan, here's a brief introduction. Susan moved to Devon from London in 2011. She really loves living near the countryside and the coast. She worked as a psychotherapist for many years, but retired in 2022. She also worked for a branch of Mind, and the projects she was involved in are those that help users of mental health services lead fuller lives. If you know anyone who is experiencing care, mental health care, you will know that it can sometimes be very isolating and disruptive, even though it's actually intended as a therapy. Susan read English at Oxford, and she has an MA in creative writing from Bath Spa Universities. She's published 2 collections of poetry and 2 pamphlets, one of which won a competition. And her poetry has appeared in magazines and anthologies. I'm sure that I'm somebody who knows her less well than many of you, but she's clearly got a very broad approach, and her writing has spanned many subjects. Tonight, we're looking at this amazing novel, The Box. If you haven't seen the cover, I will hold it up. You can see some leaves and a mysterious box. And we're going to be talking about the characters and the themes. Susan, can you tell me, first of all, what inspired you to write this story?
Well, the original inspiration was just hearing a colleague of mine say that she'd lost her twin sister. And that started me thinking about and imagining well, first of all, what it would be like to be a twin. And then secondly, what it would be like to lose a twin. Because it just seems such a very special sort of relationship. And I suppose following on from that, I've written a lot in my poems about grief and loss, and it is one of my themes, if you like. And so that was kind of in the mix. And also, I think when I'm planning a novel, more and more bits about it gradually become clear. So, for instance, it became clear that Kate had a husband and a child. And it also became clear that the twins had been sexually abused. And it just seemed to me very likely that if Kate died, then memories of the abuse might well come to the surface for Joe, who's the surviving twin. So I didn't set out to write a novel about mental health. I set out to write, as I think I usually do, a novel about people and the relationships between them, because a central part of the book is the relationship between Jo and her brother-in-law Richard. And at one stage, Jo was in a relationship, or almost in a relationship, with Richard. And in the course of the novel, they develop. It's difficult to use the word relationship because people think you mean a sexual relationship, but in this case, I don't. But a relationship develops between them, and I suppose that was, in a way, one of the main pivots of the book. So in other words, I didn't start out write a novel about a particular theme. I started out to write a novel about these particular characters.
Yes, and they come across very strongly as individuals. They have their own voice. I wonder if you could start reading a small piece from the book about when Richard was on his way home from Devon.
Yes, so what's happened so far, this is quite, well, very near the beginning. Richard has been down to Devon, thinking that he's going to find a place to scatter his wife's ashes. But in fact, what happens is that he just knows it's not the right place, and it sort of becomes very clear that he's not actually ready to do it. And so this is him just coming back home again. Coming back to Edinburgh, the box of ashes in his suitcase, wrapped in Kate's marbled silk scarf, Richard felt he'd failed her, that giving her half-heartedly to the wrong place would have been far worse. You knew it wasn't right, he said to her in his mind. He'd been to the estuary again yesterday, but farther up, one of the few places on that side where you could get down to the water. The noise of a train on the line behind him, so close he could almost have touched it, had jarred through his body. The spot was perfect otherwise, a grassy bulge into the river, shaded by trees, near a long, narrow rind of shingle. But noise had always disturbed Kate. Perhaps this wasn't the right estuary. It had to be a place that she loved and had been happy in. Perhaps nearer to Teignmouth. He'd been there with her a long time ago and didn't find it as magical as her childhood memories. But that wouldn't matter if it was right for her. He'd have to ask Jo what she thought, even if that risked her anger and upset. They'd already passed the pitted red cliffs of Dawlish and the jaunty moored boats in the ex-estuary, beached on mud at low tide. Kate and Jo had called it the extuary. They'd always played with words. They'd sometimes invited him to join in, though he was nowhere near as quick as they were. In his mind, he could hear Kate saying the word extuary and see her mischievous smile. Somewhere in the background, Jo smiled too, like her, but more uncertain. Remembering Kate's smile brought the rest of her to life. Her body against his, her bony arms and firm thighs, her dark, spicy perfume, the warm flutter of her breath against his cheek. She was so real, he had to glance round to make sure she wasn't there. Her presence kept catching him at unexpected moments, then left him as suddenly as it came. I remembered your word, he whispered secretly to her. now seeing nothing more than the grey imitation leather seat beside him. I know you're still here. The image of the black box, cosseted in the delicate purple scarf, replaced her with such immediacy, it left him gasping, as if the sea outside had drenched him through the window. It couldn't really be her in there. His mind must have played a trick. It was like the dreams he kept having, where she'd gone away somewhere and was on her way back. After Starcross, the line ran inland. The flat fields with their glassy patches of flood water calmed him, even though they were an inescapable sign that the climate was tipping out of balance. He leant back in the broad seat, wiping his handkerchief over his face, and stretched out his legs, relieved there was no one there to see him. He'd been lucky enough to get a cheap upgrade to first class. It gave him a table to himself in an almost empty carriage, drafty with air conditioning. He didn't pick up the fresh copy of the Times that had been put out for him, but sat staring as the steward refilled his cardboard cup with coffee. At least 7 hours till he could wheel his case up the slope at Waverley Station. 7 hours of forgetting and remembering that Kate wasn't there. He left a message on Rick's phone, reassuring him that he'd be home today. The memory of Rick's pale, bleak face squeezed at his heart. He longed to be back with his son, even though their shared pain was as jagged as broken glass. Rick needed him. He mustn't let himself turn away. At the thought of seeing his son, his eyes shut of their own accord, as if a heavy curtain had come down. He rested his head back against the seat, his mind blank with the enormity of what they faced.
I love that section. It pulled me into the book when I first read the manuscript, that moment when he's coming back. It must have been quite a large amount of writing you did. I know, because I'm in the middle of writing my second novel. And I wondered, how long did it take you from start to finish? Do you remember?
Well, I didn't write it straight through from start to finish. I wrote part of it, and then I sort of got diverted into writing poetry. And because I did a poetry course, and then I joined a group called, God, what was it called? Bernie, help me, what was it called? Jo Bell's group. 42. Where, you know, there was a poet, and Rachel was in it too. And there were poetry prompts every week, you know, and everybody was busily writing poem after poem. And so I did that, and then I sort of got sidetracked into poetry. And then at some stage, I just decided that I was going to come back and finish this novel. And at one point, I had a 1-week writing retreat in the Forest of Dean, which was a birthday present from some friends. And you know, did a lot of work on it there, and then carried on doing bits of work on it when I could. And then I had a residency at a place called, I don't know how you pronounce it, Brissonsville, in Cornwall, at Cape Cornwall. And I had 2 weeks there, sitting overlooking the sea. And I remember I was writing one scene that's based in Alexandra Palace in London. And there I was, sitting there, looking out of the window, overlooking the sea, you know, on the tip of Cornwall. It was a very strange experience. It was like I was in 2 places at once.
Yeah.
So I can't really say how long it took, but you know, it happened over a number of years.
Did you notice that the book changed or matured between the time you started it and when you finished it?
Quite possibly, yes. I think when I came back to it, I was clearer about where it was going and where the characters were going.
I find it, I've had a gap between when I started the present one and now, and I think there's a benefit to it. When you're writing, and this is not your first book, obviously, do you have a reader in mind? A typical reader or an ideal reader?
I suppose someone who's fairly emotionally literate, if you like, and who doesn't mind reading things that may be quite dark or difficult in places. I mean, I don't think the book is all dark by any means, but there are some very dark places in it. And so somebody who's willing to sort of stay with that and you know, doesn't just want a bit of light reading. Yeah.
Someone with a bit of, perhaps courage is the wrong word, but grit to be with the characters and go through it with them rather than back away.
Something like that, yes.
As you say, there are some wonderfully funny bits of the book, actually. And do you, as I do, have somebody who helps you as a beta reader to pick up the novel at an early stage and give you feedback?
I would always run it past as many people as I can. I used to be part of a wonderful writing group that came out of the MA at Bath Spa, and we were always sending each other work and you know, critiquing each other's work. And one of those people has now become a best-selling novelist and really, you know, knows her stuff. So I did. I ran it past, you know, some people who are here, as well as other people who whose opinions I value. I wouldn't dream of sending a novel out or a poetry collection out to a publisher without having at least one or two people read through it first.
It's amazing what you find out, isn't it?
Mm.
I won't bother you with what I found out about my book, but I'm enormously indebted to the person who's reading it at the moment. So it's a series of fascinating characters and some very dark moments. But personally, what was your biggest challenge in writing the book?
I don't know about personally, but my biggest challenge in writing a novel is always plot. You know, that's the aspect of novel writing that I find most difficult and most challenging. And I'm not sure there's really quite enough plot in this. It was challenging writing some of Joe's more extreme experiences, but it was also very compelling. And you know, I didn't mind doing that. It affected me quite a lot, but not unbearably so. But actually getting the whole, you know, the whole thing together and sort of making a coherent whole of it, I think is sometimes much more of a challenge.
Yes, it is actually a very coherent book. I sometimes come across books with too much flashback or too much parallel plots, and the reader can get lost. They can lose the benefit of getting to know the characters if you do too much of that. And one of the biggest characters in the book, obviously, is the woman who's just died, Kate. And we learn a lot about her from the memories of Jo, her twin sister, and Richard, her husband, as was. But I also really enjoyed reading about Fran, Richard's sister, and his Buddhist friend V, he used to talk to about grief. Have you got a personal favorite among the characters?
I found that a very interesting question because I think my favourite characters, or the characters I was most interested in writing about, aren't necessarily the nicest people. I mean, like Fran, you know, Fran is a very nice person, and so is V. You know, and a very white, and V is quite white. He's a Buddhist monk. But I mean, obviously, as I've said, I found writing about Jo very compelling. And I also really enjoyed writing about Marion, who's the mother of Jo and Kate, who
Mm.
is pretty awful in some ways, a very cold and quite hard person. But also she's got she's very intelligent and observant, and she's got a rather sardonic sense of humor. And there's one scene which is a WI meeting, which I'm not reading tonight. It's a WI meeting in a village hall, and I'm looking at it through her eyes, and it's one of the few places where I was able to be really funny in the book, I think, and I enjoyed that. But I mean, I think as you're writing about characters, you sort of develop an affection for all of them,
Mhm.
or nearly all of them, except the ones who are really kind of seen from outside, like Dr. Greenland, the awful psychiatrist. I can't say I felt much affection for him, but most of them.
Yes, because most people get the way they are from what's happened to them. They're not necessarily bad, but they've been formed like a pebble on a beach, and it's difficult for them to be something else when it's needed.
Mm.
But definitely, Marion, very interesting. Now, I'm hoping you're going to read us a piece about Jo. And I think the one we talked about was the one where she's in the charity shop on page
That's
34,
right.
was it?
Yes. Um, she's got a part-time voluntary job in a charity shop, and she finds it quite hard, really. But anyway, she gets there. It was 10 when she got to the shop. When the bus got to the shop, to her stop. Jo hitched on her rucksack, pulled her jacket around her, and crossed the road to the charity shop, which stood between a French patisserie and an expensive shoe shop. Excuse me. Moswell Hill was like a town of its own, much more of a place than Bounds Green. Once she would have enjoyed the cafes and bookshops. Now they intimidated her. Her charity shop sold clothes that had been worn by well-off people. Estelle was arranging a cardigan on a dummy in the window. Jo tried to slink past her, hunching her shoulders in anticipation. Estelle stepped back and looked at her with a concern that was more like annoyance. I was wondering if you were all right. Only with you, I'm never quite sure. We've had a lot come in today already, and I could do with some help. I don't suppose you could manage to ring us next time you're going to be late. Jo rushed past her into the little room, choked by the blistering hurt. The room had no proper door. The hanging strips of plastic slapped her as she fought through them. If it hadn't been for with you, she might have managed to say something back. But the fear of being seen to be ill stopped her. People like you, she wanted to say to Estelle, people like you are horrible. Your spiky black eyelashes and dyed black hair and blood-red lipstick that seeps into the lines in your upper lip. You only care about other people who are normal, like your precious fucking daughter. Hot tears were spilling down Jo's cheeks. It was like mother who didn't care, who'd like Jan's more, but even so, not really that much. Now Jan's was gone. The loneliness struck her with the force of the physical pain. She sat down hard on a black bag of clothes, pressing her hands over her face to stifle the sound that threatened to come out. As soon as she could bear it, she wiped her hands down her cheeks and went over to the small sink in the corner where people filled the kettle. She splashed her face with cold water and, not bothering to find the towel, wiped it on a t-shirt that didn't smell too much. She wasn't going to come back to the shop. Nobody could make her. She felt in her pocket for Richard's card. The corners were bent over, and there was a diagonal crease along the top. But something about the picture, the tall stepped gables, the domestic simplicity of the servants in the courtyard, was calming. It wasn't Oxford. The houses didn't have the shut-in coldness of Mother's house in Polstead Road. Mother's house. It was Mother's, and not hers or Jans's. Just as the house she lived in now was the landlord's and not hers. And Mother was always Mother. She'd never liked being called Mum or Mummy. The other girls at school thought that was strange, just as they thought it was strange that Jo and Jans never invited them back to tea. Desolate was the word that came now. Jo pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, catching the skin between her teeth. If she'd had a blade, she would have cut. Beyond the curtain, she could hear Estelle and a customer comparing notes about their grandson's bar mitzvahs. It made the shop feel even more alien. My daughter, Estelle was saying, with such love and pride, Jo wanted to punch her. Mother had never talked about her or Jans in a voice like that, except Jans after she died. Sorry, I should have explained that Jans or Jansis changed her name to Kate, but Jo still thinks of her as Jans. I'll just take those through, Estelle said to the customer. Thank you very much for thinking of us. Jo jumped up and started rooting through one of the black bags, her back towards the entrance. 2 more bags were pushed through the plastic strips. How's it going? Estelle called from outside. We could do with some new stock out here. Jo said nothing. I said we could do with some more stock. Jo picked up a few garments and an imitation cut glass ashtray that she'd priced last time and shuffled backwards through the curtain with them. Is that all? Estelle said scornfully, examining the ashtray. Then she stared at Jo's face and said, Are you all right? Jo was gazing at the pale wood floor. What is it, dear? Estelle said. She actually sounded kind, which made Jo want to cry again. My sister. The word weighed her mouth down. There was so much she couldn't say. Is there something the matter with your sister? She died. It felt shameful to say so. Sorry, what was that? I didn't catch it. She died, Jo mumbled again. Oh, dear God, you never said. Estelle's eyes widened behind the heavy mascara. I am sorry. When somebody has, problems like you've had, well, I never thought something awful might have happened. She shook her head. Your sister, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. I wish you long life. Jo had heard Estelle say that to an old man who had lost his wife. It must be something Jewish people said, as if he'd wanted a long life any more than she did. Estelle brushed her lips past Jo's cheek and patted her shoulder. Look, you go home, darling, she said, just as Jimmy barged through the door with a large box that the driver had unloaded from the van. You don't have to worry about the shop. Jimmy grinned at them. Jo couldn't make her face move in response. She shoved past him into the back room and picked up her rucksack. Bye, she said to Estelle, with a muttered thank you that fell onto the doormat. She wasn't sure if she'd be able to go back. Estelle's kindness hurt too much.
I mean, as we read the book, the complexity of what Jo's dealing with, losing a twin and everything that happened in her past and her mother, come through very strongly. Some of the characters we meet are mental health professionals, some of them really lovely and some less so. Did you put them there to develop the plot, or is it possible that they let you talk about mental health services in the UK?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Obviously, they're there mainly because having decided that Jo was somebody in the mental health system, then by definition, she would have mental health professionals around her. And, particularly as a psychiatrist and a community psychiatric nurse. But then having put them in, I think I realized it wasn't so much about mental health services in the UK. It was much more about different attitudes towards people with mental health issues. So, particularly the differences, I think, and I'm speaking now as a psychotherapist, between viewing mental illness as equivalent to physical disease and seeing the symptoms. And on the one hand, and seeing, symptoms, and on the other hand, seeing them in the light of what the person has been through. And so there is a real contrast between the psychiatrist, very old-fashioned sort of psychiatrist, but I think they're still around, some of them, Dr. Greenland, as I say, and the psychiatrist who runs the crisis house that she goes into.
Yes. I mean, I found it very interesting reading about the different things. Why was the crisis house so useful to Jo? Why do you think?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think she was extraordinarily lucky to get a place, and to get a place at such short notice. And in real life, that might well not have happened. But I mean, the thing is that, first of all, it's small and it's personal, and there's a high staff to client patient ratio. And secondly, they have an understanding of trauma and abuse, and they really treat Jo as a person, not just as somebody who has an illness. And they care about and are interested in what she's been through, and are trying to support her to cope with it better. And that doesn't always happen for people in hospital. It can be very, very different. So I think, I mean, Damien, her community psychiatric nurse, tells her that she's been very lucky, and of course she doesn't believe it and doesn't think they're going to keep her there. But then I think she does realize how fortunate she is, to have that sort of care and respect that not everybody gets, unfortunately.
Yes, it's rare, but you hear about it. And I think, I mean, I know the benefits of having a support group myself, where all the people in the support group have actually been through the same thing as me. And it's enormously reassuring not to have to start from the beginning each time when someone says, "How are you?" You know that they know some of what you've been through, and they're not regarding you as weird, just as another person. And that is incredibly helpful.
Yes, and also, I mean, just to say that I did base this crisis house. I moved it into a slightly different location, but I did know someone who was also lucky enough to get a place in a women's crisis house at a time when she was having a breakdown. She started off in a psychiatric ward, and it was just horrible. I went to see her there, and I could see how awful it was. And fortunately, the psychiatrist realized that wasn't for the best for her, and managed to get her into this crisis house, and it made such a difference. So that that some of that is based on real life, actually.
Now, you've read us two wonderful pieces about the two main characters in the book, and there's a piece where we see them together when Richard visits Jo at her flat, and I think you might be reading that.
Yes, he's just coming up to the front door. He made his way along the half-submerged crazy paving and stood staring at the chipped blue paint on the front door. To the right of the door were two bells. The lower one had a stick-on label with Gaines in blotchy felt pen. The one above it had a strip of card in the plastic holder, printed with the name Friedland. For a moment, he thought this couldn't be Joe. Then he realized it was the manufacturer's label. He'd been caught like that once before. People were meant to take the label out and write their own name on the other side. It didn't surprise him that she hadn't. He didn't imagine she'd welcome visitors. He stood there for a while and was about to ring again when the heavy door opened, just enough for him to see her looking warily out at him. "Hi, Joe," he said, with an unintended note of false heartiness. "Oh, it is you." She glanced away and didn't open the door any wider. She looked rumpled, as though she'd been taken by surprise. He didn't think he was too early. For a moment, he stood wondering whether she was going to invite him in. Then, just as he was about to ask, she seemed to come back from wherever she'd been and stepped aside for him to pass. He had to stop himself offering her a hug and made do with the best smile he had. She looked up at him with a flicker of surprise, then gave him a grin that lifted the corners of her mouth. It was so unexpected and so much like Kate that it shot straight to his heart. She turned and started walking up the stairs, leaving him to follow. He couldn't help noticing the hallway. It was so much what he'd expected and hoped not to find. Grey-blue cord carpet curled up at the edges, showing its cracked black backing. White painted wood chip on the walls, flaking and peeling at the joints. A smell of dust and damp. Faint whiffs of smoke and stale urine coming from the ground floor flat. He felt sad for Jo before he even reached her door. She'd already gone inside, but had left it ajar. He knocked softly and pushed the door open into a small dark hallway cluttered with carrier bags and piles of unopened envelopes. She was standing just inside what must be the living room, nibbling a fingernail. "Do you want to come in?" "If it's okay." He wasn't sure. The shell of privacy surrounding her was almost tangible. She nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to talk to you." She pushed back a strand of hair that had fallen over her face, and Richard saw again the ghost of a grin. She was 40, just as Kate had been, coming up to 41, but she seemed as young as when he'd first known her, barely out of her teens. When the grin petered out, she gazed at him intently, her eyes naked, as if she didn't have a grown-up face to put on. They could have been Kate's eyes, except that Kate's were never so anguished, always faintly guarded. He looked down, noticing the worn brown carpet was cleaner than he expected. Perhaps she'd made an effort on his behalf. There was an old carpet sweeper in a corner, behind a cathode-ray TV that must have stopped working years ago. He took in the rest of the room. The coffee table was ringed and stained. The heaps of letters and papers looked as though they'd been shuffled together in haste. The gas fire in the old pink-tiled fireplace was of a kind he remembered from his childhood, with a wood surround that had begun to disintegrate. None of it surprised him. All of it depressed him. Jo shouldn't have to live like this, but he guessed she wouldn't thank anyone for trying to make it different. "Do you want coffee?" she asked anxiously. "I bought some milk." "If it's no trouble." She winced, and he realized that could have meant he thought she wasn't capable. God, how sensitive did he have to be? He was treading among all the pieces of a damaged life.
Wow. And if you want to know more, you will have to read the book. It's just fantastic. Susan, thank you very, very much for talking to me and reading from your novel. And thank you to the audience for sharing this and for keeping so beautifully quiet. So now if you'd like to come off mute, that's absolutely fine. And if you'd like to say anything or ask a question, please raise a hand. I think, Fiona, you've got a hand waving. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Oh yes, thank you. Yes, I was actually clapping, but I did put a question in the chat actually. So thank you, Susan. I very much enjoyed listening to all that, and I will get a copy of the book. My question was about characters, and I'll just read what I wrote. When it comes to I'm thinking of, I don't know if you've heard of Don Murray. He was an American coach, writer, and so on. And he, like the South African novelist Coetzee, they both claim that all writing is autobiographical, inescapably autobiographical. So I just wondered what your thoughts were. Or was it more like Alice Walker, who just sort of felt herself becoming peopled with these other characters that were their separate selves? So there are kind of two extremes, and perhaps you're somewhere in the middle. I was just wondering about any of that.
I think that's a great question. I don't think it's either or. I think it's some of both. I was thinking a bit about this. And funnily enough, again, I think there's an analogy with being a psychotherapist in that when I used to see clients, I might have several clients in one day, all of whom were totally different from each other and totally different from me. And yet somehow when I was with them, I would very often feel, oh yes, that's like me. Yes, I recognize myself in that, even though the person as a whole wasn't like me. And I think something similar applies to writing characters in a novel. Certainly if you're writing from within them, I mean, like there are characters in the novel, like Joe's downstairs neighbor, Eric Gaines, and the aforesaid Dr. Greenland, who I'm not really writing about from inside at all. They're more from observation, I think, or possibly, based on people I've known. But I think in a lot of the characters, aspects of me come into play. I mean, like there are certainly aspects of me that come into Joe, although in a much less extreme form. And Fran, for instance, it is kind of in a way, I can see my sort of well-intentionedness and do-gooderiness in Fran. And even though those characters are completely different, and in Richard too, his struggle with his emotions and how to get his emotions across, I think I can, I can, so I think what I do, I put bits of myself into different characters, but they're not wholly, none of them are wholly me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That makes total sense.
Helen, do you want to share your question? Can you unmute?
Yes, yes, Susan, I'm interested in the title you've chosen for the book, The Box, and I wonder how far the box is symbolically central to the novel, and I'm interested in the difficult significance of a box of somebody's ashes, and that's a very challenging reality to have to adjust to, and also the importance of the location for the box, because I know you gave quite a bit of thought for where it should be given and how important that is, to the relief of the bereaved person as well, and the sense of doing something appropriate and sensitive for the loved one, you know. So I wondered what your thoughts were about that.
Yes, I think that, you know, the box has great significance. And for instance, over time, you know, to start with, Richard keeps it wrapped up in the scarf and puts it away in the wardrobe because he just can't bear to look at it. And over time, he comes to a point where he unwraps it and puts it on a shelf and wants to see it because it's like that's his connection with Kate.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of there. And like when he first tells Jo that he's got the ashes, she said, "You've got my sister there, that's horrible." You
Mm-hmm.
know, and over time she kind of adjusts to that. And the fact that you know, the idea of scattering the ashes is something that they both share, you know, and they do find a place in the end. Yes, so really part of the sort of emotional arc of the book,
Mm.
what happens to the box,
Mm.
because
Mm.
at the end, the intention is that Rick, Richard and Kate's son, who doesn't go with them to scatter the ashes, that he will have a little ceremony where he buries the box, the empty box. So yeah, so that's why I felt it needed to be there in the cover design.
Mm-hmm.
It's a presence that's there really in some way throughout the book.
And how did they decide, and you decide on what was the appropriate location for that box?
That was quite difficult. um, well, you know, I just visited various places, and there was one place by the sea that I was going to have as the location, and for various reasons that didn't feel quite right. So it ended up, well, I won't say where it ended up, but you know, just having looked at various places, there was just a feeling, oh yes, that would be a good place. You know, that would be the right place.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm.
know you suggested various places and they didn't quite work, but never mind.
No, it's got to be something absolutely appropriate for the
Yeah,
bereaved person and the person who's died. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Interesting.
Thank you.
It was fascinating.
Mm.
Now, can I just ask something? There's somebody called Amanda who's been waving bits of paper. Did you want to talk, or are you just doing something?
No, I think she's
Oh,
Just organizing her office or something?
yes, looks like.
Brilliant. Would anyone else like to say anything or ask any questions? Don't worry if you don't want to. There's an awful lot to process in what we've been listening to.
Diana. Wants to.
Diana?
Diana.
Brilliant.
But I don't think she's.
I just wanted
Yeah.
to, hello, I just wanted to say
Hello.
I liked the way it was structured in that each section, like a chapter, was, you know, from that person's point of view, and I thought that worked really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I sort of knew I wanted to do it like that. I'm not quite sure why. It was just that felt like the right way to do it.
Mm.
It helps actually if you're reading the whole book. It helps you keep track of where you are emotionally because you know who each chapter is actually called by the name of the person who is the central character in it. And some books like you to work that out as you come into the chapter. But in this case, the book is so dense and so full of meaning that you don't want to be pushing your reader. You want to help them as much as you can without giving away everything that's going to happen. And so having that as a structure, I think, was really helpful.
Mm. And just to say that most of the book is either from Jo's point of view or Richard's, but there are a few chapters that are written from other people's points of view, like Marion, the mother, or there's a little bit that's written from Fran's point of view as well. Just at one point where I wanted to see what was happening for Richard through her eyes, really. That felt right to do that.
Yes, because it is very
yeah.
difficult when you care about someone and they're going through a bereavement. You never really know what to say to them. And she's such an interesting presence, Fran. So I thoroughly enjoyed editing this and being part of its journey to being published. And I just really want to thank Susan for bringing it to Palewell Press, and all of you for the support you've given her and for coming this evening. And I hope you really enjoy the book. It's
So,
very
yeah,
special.
it's a good place to get it from Palewell Press, not Amazon, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or I have got some copy. If you really want a signed copy, you can get it from me. But I haven't got that many copies. I'm going to buy a few more from Palewell.
Might take you up on that.
Rachel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and I've already written it in the chat, but I just feel because it is a launch, I just want to say well done, Susan. I know how much it's meant to you and your frustration over the years of wanting to get a novel into print. And you've done it. You've finally done it. And I can see much more, even from the bits that you've been reading, how you feel kind of more at home with prose. And it somehow gives you scope to explore the characters and your acute observation, the way you flesh out a location or a person. And it's quite a feat to write a whole book. So I just wanted to say that, because we've been saying it in the chat, but I want you to hear it.
Thank you.
And sustaining that, Susan, over a long period of time is interesting. What Camilla and you were both saying, that returning to it, you probably benefit, and the depth of the character might benefit from the period of time you've taken to reflect. And I don't know, it just seems to have been a very productive process, but you have to be really committed over quite a period of time too.
And of course, you've changed as well.
Exactly.
I noticed about the book I'm writing now. I'm now not just a better writer, I think, but I've changed in the years since I began writing it. The book definitely reacts to that. The story.
And you put a link, Camilla. People are asking, can you put a link to Palewell Press?
Yeah, let me put one into the chat.
Thanks.
Sorry, on that subject, just to say, what was I going to say? The thing about writing a novel is that it gets tremendously immersive. You know, you really live it, and the characters, you know, a lot of my novelist friends have said this, the characters become like real people to you. You know, they're not. So in that way, sustaining it over a long period of time isn't quite so hard as you might think, because it's like this this world that you're in.
But you're inhabiting a variety of characters, some of whom are more sympathetic than others, and that's quite an achievement to sustain that variety and continue to convince people in the reality of these characters. Yeah.
Just give me a moment for the link, by the way, if anybody is desperate to dash off. I did promise myself I would have this to hand, but rather than give you the wrong thing.
May I just say something?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't find my raised hand. I don't know if I'm audible. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you, Susan. And just to make a point about your reading voice, it's just been a complete revelation to me to listen to you read the text. And as I've been listening, I'm thinking of Radio 4. I'm thinking of the novel being heard, because it's such, you create for me such a powerful space around the characters and their voices and their presences. I think I read a little in manuscript, I think maybe, but hearing you read was astonishing. And so I don't know how that sits professionally, Camilla. I've got no experience whatsoever. But
I definitely think if we can get some of this onto the radio, it will be good for the book.
absolutely wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Made for hearing as well as reading.
Well, I have been contemplating. I had a look on Audible, and you can record your own audiobook and send it to them. So I've just been wondering, can I possibly do that? To which the answer is probably no. But yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice to do that. I felt, the first extract I read, I was a bit kind of sort of cranking it up. But by the third extract, I really got into it, into the reading.
And I think yours is the voice that ought to read it, because you know the book so intimately. And you know the moments where you pause and things are discerned by the reader, and then you go on. It's brilliant. We've got a couple more questions. Bernie, do you want to say something?
I was just going to ask, quite simply, when you're writing, you said you're not sure how plotty the book is, but your characters sound really strong and well known to you. Do you find that sometimes you're heading along a plot curve and you get to a decision point in the story, and the character that's at the focus of that decision point, because they're quite a strong character that you developed, takes you away from the plotting that you were hoping for? And how do you deal with it if that happens?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because the way I've gone about writing a novel is that I do sketch out an outline, and I'm usually very clear where I want to start and where I want to finish, and then I try and do a more or less sort of chapter by chapter or section by section, and then I start writing, and then I find that it doesn't happen quite like that. It begins to go where it wants to go rather than where I think it's going to go necessarily. And like when I look back after I finished this, I somehow look back at the notes I'd written when I was planning it, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. That didn't happen there. That happened later, or that happened much earlier. And oh, that didn't happen at all because something else happened. So I know some people really plan their novels in great detail and stick to it, but that's not how I work. But I have to have some kind of outline, I think, before I start. I'm not at the other end where I just start writing with no idea where I'm going at all. I can't do that.
No, I once heard, I think it might have been Patrick Ness say that he knew how he was starting, and he had like having a roadmap or knowing what was at the end of the road, but he only had his driving at night and had the main beam on, and he could only see so far, and there'd be roadworks, there'd be things that just kind of took him off the route he was planning, but he sort of kept to a route, but stuff happened all the way along the way.
Yeah.
Which I think is an analogy.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Peter, did you have a question?
Hi, Susan. Maybe it's an unkind question, but the question is, what's next? You've been pursuing this for such a long time, and you have other novels in your drawer somewhere, I know. Do you have a forward plan? Do you have another glimmer in the back of your mind, or even do you have half a novel written?
No, I don't have half a novel written. I started sketching out another novel, and I've also got a project which I've been working with for some time. No, I've had it in my mind for some time. I haven't really done that much, concerted work on it. which is a sort of memoir of the time when I was around 15, 16, when a lot of, which was a very difficult time. And my feeling has been that I want that to be a mixture of poetry and prose.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I've been so taken up with this and all the, the editing and proofreading and launch arranging and everything, that it'll be nice to just have some space to get back to writing and see what comes. I mean, I think I would like to do the memoir and just sort of clear that out of the way before I then move on to something else, whatever that may be.
I found that when I finished writing the first book, I felt quite lost because I had been so totally inhabiting the characters' world and their problems and so on, and having to sort of set them aside and see them as a book again was quite disturbing. And now the second book I'm writing about the same characters, I feel, back. But I don't know whether other people find this, but I took a real emotional dip of thinking I'd succeeded and then wondering what I was going to do with myself. So it was quite a surprise. But I hope that you get onto the memoir or whatever at a good time. It sounds interesting.
Yes, I think I notice when I get near the end, I tend to spin things out a bit because I don't actually want to finish it and leave them all,
Brilliant. Well, I think we may have come to the end of the questions. Is that correct? Or does anyone have something that they would like to? Or if you would all like to come off mute and just join me in clapping, Susan, I would be thrilled.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan.
Want to open us up?
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for bearing with me. And, it's been really nice and really interesting because I've never done this sort of launch before. I've always just read poems along with other people reading poems, or mainly done that. So to talk about a book in depth is really great.
Yeah, really good the way it enabled us to enter that world. It's more difficult with poetry because you're introduced to a lot of different themes, and we were focusing in on these characters in this world in quite a helpful and interesting way.
Yes, and finally, I would say I hope it will inspire some people to read the book.
Yes,
it'd be nice for me. I know Claire's got it. Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant.
I just wanted to add one thing, just that Susan, that I do feel very proud of you, and because Susan and I trained on the same training 24 years ago, 25 years ago.
More than that.
Was it? It seems like yesterday. But I have known of her ambition to write a book right from the start, when she was writing, poetry, and gave me a little bit of helpful criticism at one point for something I wrote. And so thank you for that. And it's just great to be part of this evening and to celebrate Susan's first novel. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Brilliant.
Here's to more.
Yes, here's to more.
Yeah.
You definitely have that character that you can write in depth about people and make us believe them. Anyway, thank you all very, very much for coming. It's been a thrill. I was quite nervous this evening, and it feels like it's done what it needed to show you how interesting the book is. And so I will say a really heartfelt good night.
Night.
And just to say thank you, Camilla.
Yes,
for
thank you.
hosting it.
Thank you.
And for holding it all together like that.
Brilliant.
And for all the work you did on the book.
Well, I think it was definitely a collaborative thing. You knew what you needed, and you were very patient with me as I worked my way through it. Brilliant.
Outcome. Yeah.
Okay, and We have been recording this, and I will let Susan know as soon as it's on YouTube. So if anybody hasn't seen it and you want them to see it, you'll be able to point them in the right direction.
Great.
Brilliant.
Much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good night.
Nice
Well
evening.
done.
Thank you all.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Well done,
Good
Susan.
night. Thank you.